curtain has finally fallen on Norwich City's Premier League tragedy. The latest show was one that the directors and producers promised would be a major hit. Instead, it was another torrid tale that saw a much-loved protagonist removed inside the opening half of the first act before being replaced by an experienced and steady character hoping to ride his way through the storm. In the end, the rest of the performers were unable to prevent the plot from unfolding in the miserable yet predictable conclusion many feared. This is this week's PinkUn Norwich City Podcast in association with Future Radio. I'm your host, Connor Southwell. Joining us to sift through the wreckage of the Canaries' top flight season, as well as that 5-0 defeat to Tottenham, is Paddy Davitt and Adam Harvey. So, Pad, on the theme of the introduction that I've just given there, how would you review Norwich City's Premier League campaign if we were to go down that old-fashioned way of looking at it? It's been one that will probably be consigned to the history books for all the wrong reasons, truth told.
Yeah, well, I was trying, as you were explaining that, Connor, I was trying to come up with some sort of pithy Oscar-related theme, but it wasn't really working. So, it certainly isn't one that they'll be turning into an Oscar winner, that's for sure, or a play in the West End, if we want to labour this theme a little bit. But it was essentially another hugely disappointing attempt at Premier League sustainability. And if we're being brutally honest, to even label it an attempt feels a little bit disingenuous. You know, that, for me, certainly is the most damning indictment, that it didn't feel like an attempt, not one worthy of the name. There wasn't a competitiveness to it. I put it in my pointers, actually, after the game on Sunday, which was an entirely predictable outcome. I think we all felt that anyway, as good as Tottenham were and are. That, fundamentally, it just feels that, Leeds scrambled to safety, finished 17th, I think, and Norwich are 16 points behind them. How can you be 16 points behind the club who finished 17th, let alone the clubs above them? And as you tick into mid-table and then above, it just really... And then you look at the goals scored, the goals they conceded, the minus 61 goal difference. Only that wretched Derby team apparently have a worse goal difference in Premier League history. All the metrics pulled together underline was really a completely timid, anemic offering from Norwich on the pitch, off the pitch. And as we sit here still, we're yet to hear from anybody above Dean Smith in the Norwich food chain, be it that sporting director, be it that executive director, or be that owners and board level. And the silence is deafening now. And, in that void, understandably, there's a lot of frustration, which was already there, and in certain quarters has expressed itself in protest. Again, the last 3 home games, there was that post-match backdrop. Whatever the scale of the protest, it is there. You can't ignore it. And that... But even if you put that to one end of the spectrum, I think the majority, the ones who are maybe had tickets and were not going to games. I spoke to somebody, I won't reveal his identity, a long-standing season ticket holder. He said essentially they stayed in the bar at half-time and very swiftly left in the second half. And in his view, anybody who really stayed as a fan for that lap of appreciation, charade, he couldn't understand really the mindset. Why would you want to applaud the football club generally, but Dean Smith and his players for what they didn't serve up over the previous 8 or 9 months? And as you rightly said at the outset, Connor, not solely Dean Smith, it was Daniel Farker and his coaching staff. Palpably as a club, they got it very, very badly wrong. And until we hear from the people who shaped this direction of travel, it is hard to move on. It is hard to say, okay, that season's gone, we'll close the door on that. Let's look forward, as Dean Smith has been trying to do, trying to nudge that dial to what comes next and what comes next in terms of transfer situation, and then beyond that, moving into the Championship. All of that, I'm sure, is where fans want to look to a brighter horizon, albeit back in the Football League. But it's very hard to get past closing the door on what's gone if you don't hear from the people who were in charge of what that looked like and why it looked like that and why it was so uncompetitive. We all have our theories. We all feel we know the areas where they got it badly wrong. But we need to hear some culpability and acknowledgement, and probably then to throw it forward why it's going to be any different moving on from here if the same characters are in place.
Absolutely. This is the fourth week now since Norwich City's relegation was confirmed. We're obviously recording this on the Tuesday after the Tottenham game, but it was the 30th of April against Aston Villa that their relegation was confirmed. We're sat here on the 24th of May, and still no word from anyone above Dean Smith, who of course is contractually obliged to give interviews as well. So that obviously will need to change at some point, because for me it feels like, to actually fully put a line under what has been a torrid season, as we said at the outset, there does need to be some communication and some accountability as well, I think, and people want to hear some answers to some very pointed questions as well, I'm sure, as to why this season hasn't panned out differently. And I was looking actually today where we were a year ago, and it was the day that we released our kind of big documentary on the Championship title season winning extravaganza that was last year in those COVID times. Fans obviously weren't there to see it, but it just goes to show how quickly football moves on, because that feels like a lifetime ago now. And there was lots of praise for Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber, and 12 months later, one isn't at the club anymore, and another one is coming under increasing pressure. So all very interesting. But Adam, to reflect on Sunday a little bit, did anything surprise you, about the result, the 5-0 defeat, but also the performance? Because I think actually when you look over the piece, that's a performance that is just kind of relatively standard for this group of Norwich City players this season. When Paddy talks about a lack of competitiveness, okay, Spurs have quality, but this was another glaring example of just how short Norwich City are at this level.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Arsenal fans and the media were bigging it up because Spurs still needed to come to Carrow Road and get at least a point to guarantee their top four place. And I think most Norwich fans were saying to Spurs fans, don't worry, you're going to come to Carrow Road and probably roll over and get an easy 3 points. And it's exactly what happened. I mean, it's just what we've come to expect from Norwich. I mean, the goals they're shipping, and it's more just the nature of the goals they're shipping. I mean, the second goal, the mistake from Krul, I mean, you'd get punished at League Two, even in the National League, for that silly error and that kind of defensive, mistakes that Norwich are making on a regular basis. And I think, effectively Norwich playing in the top flight and they're failing to cut those out. So yeah, it's just another frustrating performance. And I think obviously Norwich had their opportunities in the game as well. I mean, Rashica has obviously had that chance. Was it 1-0 or 2-0 at that point? And he's obviously failed to hit the target in a fairly decent shooting position. And I think that's just been the story of Norwich this season. They're just not competing. And then when they do get the chances, they fail to take them. So effectively they get punished, and rightfully so. They lost that game, well, in a similar fashion as they have most games this season.
Yeah, and we can talk about Dejan Kulusevski and the quality he has. I thought he was the best player on the pitch on Sunday. But by the same token, when you can afford to essentially miss an open goal, attempting to give Heung-min Son a goal for the Golden Boot, and then only a few minutes later cut inside Dimitris Giannoulis with ease and then curl one into the top corner, it's pretty ridiculous, isn't it? But Pad, I mean, I did want to talk about the lap of fanx, I think, as it was officially labelled. I mean, I've been going to Carrow Road now for well over a decade. I'm not sure I've seen a sadder thing on the football pitch than that. It was and that's not to blame the supporters. I think it's just a case of what the situation is. But like you say, I was possibly surprised by how many stayed. Although speaking to a few that did, the feedback I kind of got is, well, I was intrigued to see what would happen. I was intrigued to see what sort of reception they got. And as they walked over to the Barclay, there were some boos. I'd say they probably did get drowned out by applause eventually, but I mean, it kind of felt like the ultimate act of humiliation for me for that Norwich City group of players, who were, of course, led round the pitch by their head coach, Dean Smith. And
on that front, I asked him, when he came off that pitch and in very short order was in front of us for his post-match media, I said, what did that feel like? How tough was that? And he said, I think words to the effect, paraphrasing him, he never wants to repeat that again for the reasons and the emotions you've outlined. They're professional people. He's a professional, never experienced relegation in his coaching career. And they will be embarrassed. They will be, feeling that, they've been a long way short, and their frailties and their weaknesses were ruthlessly exposed, and then more so than Sunday. There was this dynamic at the final whistle where Smith and his coaching staff and his players, both the ones who were involved and the likes of Billy Gilmore and Brandon Williams who weren't. I thought it was a bit harsh. Sam McCallum was out there as well, given that he didn't, have any material impact or involvement on that season. But as they gravitated towards the centre circle, what was taking place in front of the away end was serenading Antonio Conte and those players for achieving Champions League qualification, and it was essentially, this is Norwich's house, and they were having to sort of stand there and take it and watch that celebratory feel in their own stadium. And then when Tottenham decided it was time to move over, Norwich then had to take centre stage. It was just a very pitiful sight, really, from a Norwich perspective. And credit too, I mean, I recounted that story of a season ticket holder who couldn't quite get his head around anybody who would have stayed to applaud that season, essentially. But credit to the ones who did, because I think overwhelmingly it was a positive reaction. And again, Dean Smith referenced that after the game, almost, we didn't deserve it. We didn't deserve for them, A, fans to still be in the stadium, but B, to, in the main, applaud us back. But they did, and it, without having canvassed opinion from the ones who did stay, maybe that's a reflection that their frustration and their, scrutiny lies elsewhere, lies with not Smith as a head coach, who was given a very tough order and ultimately wasn't able to do much more than Daniel Farke probably would have been able to do with that group of players. Maybe not even the players as well. I mean, you couldn't argue that they gave everything and they tried what they tried, but fundamentally they're not good enough. They didn't have the quality as a collective, front or back, with or without the ball, to compete week in, week out at Premier League level. So where does the accountability lie? Is it with Dean Smith and those players, or is it in other areas? And increasingly it feels that most fans, even if they're not moved to protest, they feel that the culpability lies above Dean Smith and those group of players. And that isn't to excuse Dean Smith and those players. And Dean Smith, I think, interestingly now, he's getting far more scrutiny and far more criticism of the fact that he wasn't able to materially improve this group, bar, those first couple of games when he came in, which of course he was always going to get a tune out of a group who were desperate to impress. There was that little fertile period in January where they beat Everton, they beat Watford and got themselves out of the bottom three for a gloriously brief interlude. But thereafter, the spiral was as probably downward as it would have been under Daniel Farke, which has prompted quite a few now fans to ask, well, why did they make the change? What did Dean Smith bring that Daniel didn't? And they are valid questions, but I keep sticking to the thought that give him a window to put his own stamp on it, which he was denied in January. Even if it isn't wholesale changes, he clearly has identified areas of this squad, and he talked to Ben about the lack of athleticism, the lack of energy, the sort of drive that you need in the middle of the park when you don't have the ball to go and win it back again. He's talked previously about, the Buendia-shaped hole they need to fill in terms of the top end of his midfield. So give him a window, give him a pre-season away from, we're in a tight spot, but we need to win games of football, and I'll just try and, by hook or by crook, come up with a template that can get us Premier League points because we need to. We're not in a phase where we can experiment. That's removed. He's got a pre-season to really embed his philosophy. He's talked rather cryptically about these 4 points that will define his playing style now. Didn't really want to go into too much detail what they are. I think they'll become fairly apparent very early on next season. But ultimately, remove any element that isn't a Dean Smith team now. That isn't a squad that he's had a transfer window to do something with, and then time in pre-season freed from the relentlessness of trying to win Premier League games of football. To actually instill his principles and his values. And then, for me, then that removes any barrier to say he's exempt from scrutiny. And what I would say, which isn't in his favour, unfortunately, and it sort of flows back to this information void that we're kind of enduring at present, is that I think patience will be wafer thin with the football club, with him and whatever squad he's got under him. When they go on the weekend of July the 31st, they need to go hard, because I think if 10 games in and they're at the wrong end of the championship, I think you will then start to see much more angst being expressed by a much wider constituency of Norwich fans than there are at present. That is for sure. So he will have to deal with that. I'm sure he's experienced enough to know that that's there and that's in the background. But while it is probably right to start to question him, given he had 23 games to work with this group, I don't think you can judge him yet. I think you have to reserve judgment till we get the other side of a transfer window and into the meat of a new season. But fundamentally, to bring it full circle, that was a sight which I'm sure he never wishes to have to repeat again in his coaching career, and certainly not as head coach of Norwich. He will be asking those players to, use that almost as fuel, as motivation. That do you want to be back here again at any point in your careers? Having to sort of essentially embarrass yourselves and put yourself out there for whatever criticism that was going to come their way. And it's a tribute to those Norwich fans that, by and large, yes, there was a small pocket of booze. I thought it was more sort of when they got around towards the Snake Pit area, but there may have been a few dissenting voices in the Barclay, but overwhelmingly that was a positive reaction. And as Dean Smith rightly said, they probably didn't deserve that. So testament to those Norwich fans. But by no manner of means do you want to have to go through that too often in your career, because visibly, graphically, it illustrated their failures as individuals and as a collective.
Yeah, and let's be honest, the majority had already made their feelings known by leaving their seat and leaving the stadium, right? So even though the overwhelming reaction maybe was positive, of the people who were in the ground, the vast majority weren't in the ground. They'd already gone. They'd already made their feelings clear, and ultimately that's possibly the most powerful way you can do it, by leaving a football ground early. And they haven't had a lot to cheer in recent weeks either. You look at Norwich City's last 3 home games, it's an aggregate score of 12-0 to the opposition. So I mean, it's just simply staggering, and it comes back to the point that we keep speaking about competitiveness or lack of, which is why I think it seems to great supporters so much more when it's Norwich City in this position, because if Norwich City were to get relegated, having finished 18th maybe, but knowing that they gave it a real go, they went to the wire, I think maybe people could stomach that a little bit more than what they're seeing at the moment, which is just a complete lack of competitiveness at this level consistently. Before we move on from the lap of fanx as well, it's worth noting that the women's team also had a lap of fanx before the game, which felt to me a little bit poorly handled, given that they were a Norwich City team who have completed a great escape this season, and I'm sure a lot of people would have liked to have given them a good reception as well for what they've achieved this season, which was pretty miraculous by all accounts. But that didn't happen. Wasn't great in my opinion. To move on then, Adam, because I don't really want to dwell on talking about the game too much, because as you kind of said, it was as we expected, probably as we've seen a lot of this season. There was a lot of players I felt who maybe, and Dean Smith kind of hinted at this, that he felt were on the sun lounges after the second and third goal went in, just in terms of body language. There was a really interesting expression that he used maybe when he came through the mix zone. He obviously comes through the mix zone where I tend to speak to a player before then going through to and speaking to Pad in the press conference, and he was speaking to Chris Gorham of Radio Norfolk, and he said the big challenge for him this summer, certainly around the mentality, is shifting what he described as a nice and comfortable mentality into one which was hard work and but also enjoyable, I think is the words he used. He wants to remove kind of that nice tag, which kind of lends me really to when we throw this ahead and look at this summer, given what Dean Smith has outlined in his public utterances around this squad, and he's been quite scathing at times around what he wants to do to it and how he feels it's underperformed. Is one window enough time for him to really implement the changes that he wants to? Is that too big of a job for him to transition from where we're at right now to the opening day of the championship season? Is it too much to expect Norwich City to be where maybe some would expect them to be in order to go again and compete in the championship?
Yeah, I think he's got 2 tasks. He's obviously got the job of trying to shift this losing culture, as he's talked about for weeks on end now. This team that's been so used to losing, and they need to go back into the championship and turn that round straight away and hit the ground running and start winning games, pretty quick, because the problem is with the Championship is if you're sort of mid-table by the halfway stage, it's very, very difficult to push your way up. I mean, there has been a few teams that have done it this season. Sheffield United and Nottingham Forest probably the most notable ones, but the Championship's pretty tough and pretty grueling, and this season it's going to be even worse because obviously we've got that World Cup break, so they're going to have to really hit the ground running. But I think what's probably the most notable point is that someone like Daniel Farker, I mean, that first season that he had in the Championship, where you could see what he was trying to do. He was trying to instill, this possession-based football, this football that no Norwich fan had ever seen before, and even very few Championship fans had probably ever seen that style of sort of possession-based football and very attacking football that he brought to the club, and most fans took to pretty quickly. And I think Dean Smith obviously has got his own identity that he wants to stamp on this squad, but it might take him time to do that because, effectively this squad that he's currently got aren't his, and the players that come in are going to need time to gel to what he wants from them, and obviously with the other players that still remain at the club. So I do think, you have maybe got to give him a little bit of time, but obviously with football, we all know that time often is something that fans, aren't willing to wait for, and they want results and an instant, sort of something on the pitch to cling to straight away. So it's a difficult one, but I do think you've got to give Dean Smith a little bit of time in the Championship, and I do think that he's definitely got the sort of the chance to maybe build a squad. We've seen him do it at Brentford. We've seen him do it at Aston Villa, and he's got both of them out of the league eventually. So, I think that's probably a good point to sort of talk about there.
Yeah, and time is a precious commodity in football, as you quite rightly say, and that's going to be the challenge, isn't it, Pad? I mean, it's already a short off season as it is. Norwich City are back for testing a month today, actually, as it happens as we record. So 4 weeks. That's the same amount of time as it's been since they were relegated. To put that into perspective, so it's felt like an eternity, but not really in reality a long period of time. So there's a lot that needs to be done from where Norwich City are now to where they probably need to be when they get back for pre-season, and then even more so for the opening day of the Championship season. So we talk about time and Dean Smith getting time, and I think he will get time. But if they think things are bad now in terms of the reaction around this Premier League relegation, then they're going to be in for a bit of a shock if that continues in the Championship.
Which is true, which is why I think, given he's an experienced operator, he knows that it can't be wholesale. You can't say to, I mean, apart from the mechanics of how do you move on, I don't know, pick a number, 50 to 60% of that squad, it's just feasibly not going to happen, even if you wish to do a slash and burn policy. So he knows it needs to be far more incremental, far more nuanced, and that will be a deft skill because you're essentially going to be relying, I think, still on the majority of this squad who have palpably failed to deliver at Premier League level. But at least in terms of that point you raise about trying to hit the ground running, that's going to be a lot easier if you've got, the nucleus, shall we say, of a group which, again, as Dean Smith has been at pains to stress, players who not only one Championship title under the belt, but in some cases two, that they know how to operate in the Championship. And on the point I put to him a couple of Fridays ago now about, but what about if they, the mental, not the Championship again, I can't be bothered with it, I want the glamour of the Premier League, I don't think mentally I can get my head around it. And he said we'd swiftly make sure that wasn't the case. So him and Shakespeare primarily. So I'm less concerned that you'll have this major churn because, as Adam rightly says, and as you rightly say, one window isn't going to be enough to get to the end of that, and it's everything that Dean Smith wants has been delivered, and now he can crack on. I think he's savvy enough to know it might take another, more than one window certainly, but probably into a 2 or 3, 4 window cycle. We saw how that was required under Daniel Farker before he got to a point where, that blended with developing young talent slash the players you already had here produced at Championship level tremendous results on 2 separate occasions. So, we have to take him at his word. He said he doesn't need or doesn't feel it's going to take wholesale changes. He talked clearly now about finding that 10 type player, who can, we're not saying he can find a like-for-like Emi Buendia type player, but certainly somebody in that ilk. And I also feel it's quite clear now, even before Tottenham, but certainly after Tottenham, and how he spoke about simply not having that athleticism and that drive and that energy that he feels they need in the middle of the park. And somebody made a good point, actually. We did a PinkUn Plus Q&A the other day, and they look back at his Villa teams, and you had, players like John McGinn. And again, I'm not saying it's going to be as simple as go and find another John McGinn, but as a template for a midfielder, Douglas Luiz as well at Aston Villa, those type of players, I think, are what Dean Smith is looking to add. And if he got those, I think he looks at the top end of the pitch. We know he is a massive fan of Teemu Pukki. We also know he's a massive fan of Adamida. I think he'd look at it and think, yeah, that'll do me in the Championship. I don't need to necessarily go out and focus too much of my energy this summer in the window looking to do anything at the top end of the pitch. Likewise, defensively, I think you've got Angus Gunn there. Whatever happens to Tim Krul, he would be a very reliable starting option in the Championship. You've got Omabama Dele to drop into that defensive unit with the likes of Sam Byram, your Nulis, Barley Mumba, even if Max was to depart. Gibson and Hanley, whether they're both here come the end of the window, who knows? But I just get the sense he looks at the makeup of this squad in terms of constituent units of a team, and he probably is thinking it's midfield. I just need to address midfield in this window. If I get that to my satisfaction, I think I've got enough there in the building to start reasonably well, and certainly over the entirety of the Championship season to be competing for promotion. So that's easier said than done. And, they will need to, I'm sure, have to be very astute in the players that they do go and target, because there's no doubt any player Norwich goes for, certainly if they're competing with Premier League clubs, it's going to be a very hard sell. So that in itself is very difficult. I certainly think if they're going for players with other Championship clubs, the financial power they've got now relative to the vast majority of the Championship, Steve Morrison, formerly of the Parish, now Cardiff boss, he was speaking there a couple of weeks ago about the churn that will be around the Championship this summer, because the finances simply aren't there for those clubs without parachute money to fall back on, is going to be pretty graphic, pretty seismic, he felt. So conversely, Norwich coming down with, we're led to believe, the most stable financial position since Webber arrived, armed with the parachute money. Dean Smith confirmed on Friday he doesn't need to sell first. There is money available for him. So all of that leads you to think, if they're astute in their recruitment, they should be able to get the targeted additions across that midfield, I think, that would afford Dean Smith the opportunity then to go, you know what, there's not a huge amount of work needed here in this window to get Norwich to be a very competitive entity. But that's all well and good. He says there won't be a hangover. He says if there's any players who don't really want to be part of it, we'll get that out of them, or we'll look to move them on. That's all well and good. But the practicalities of starting a season with that overhang of the window, which will be the same case again, and probably even more marked given the Championship kicks off very early, end of July, start of August. There's going to be a full month of inevitable speculation around maybe some of his better players and are they going to be here or not. And that doesn't improve the prospects of Norwich hitting the ground running and just focusing solely on that end point, which is getting back to the Premier League at the first available opportunity. So, there's so many moving parts to how this will play out. But fundamentally, I think you just have to look at Smith, look where he's been, look how long he's been in the game. As he said, he's been out of football. I don't know what was that figure he quoted when he first took over. A matter of weeks, is it in a career which has been football since he was 17 years of age. He's 50, early 50s now. So I think he's a very stable operator. And in this scenario, where there could be so much churn, and when you contrast with the situation at Burnley, who've joined him in the Championship, that looks to be a hellishly difficult summer they've got to navigate. And, you see from a distance reports of £60 million loans having to be repaid. They still haven't got a head coach confirmed yet to replace Sean Dyche. That looks a much more difficult ask for them to be in a competitive state come the start of the season. And of course, Watford, the other club who've joined them in the Premier League, well, they've gone in a very radical direction for them under the Pozzo sort of ownership model of plucking a guy who took Forest Green out of League Two. So that, there's a huge degree of unpredictability about how that plays out with Watford, I think, as well. So of the three relegated clubs, maybe bizarrely, probably Norwich are in the best position, it feels like, moving forward now, in terms of that stability. Maybe it doesn't feel like that at the minute, of course, given the sort of the lack of answers and lack of clarity from the top, but publicly at least. But I think under Smith's stewardship on the football aspect of this, I think they'll be okay. I I'll be very surprised if it pans out as we envisage, and it is the rump of the same squad with one or two additions, that they're not able to hit the ground in a reasonably competitive way. I just don't see a scenario where they're 10th after 10 games. I just don't see that at all. So, but stranger things have happened, and we saw how West Brom struggled when they went down last summer. There's no guarantee, absolutely no guarantee, and you can put out your mind that they've done it twice before under Webber at this level, because it's a different head coach and there's a different mood around the place, I think, now. And for those reasons alone, I think whatever's gone before under this regime in the Championship, you can put that to one side, because that isn't going to really have any impact whatsoever. This now is very firmly a different phase we're embarking upon under Dean Smith, and unless he comes out and says different, Stuart Webber.
We live Norwich City.
The build-up.
The passion.
The drama.
The last-minute winners.
The debate.
That's why we've created PinkUn Plus.
The app that takes you beyond the headlines.
With exclusive columns, blogs, podcasts and videos, we've got you covered.
Subscribe today. PinkUn Plus. Stay ahead of the game.
Download now on the App Store and on Google Play. Adam, I think Paddy's made some really good points there, particularly the ones around the teams that Norwich are coming down with. I mean, it's interesting that actually you look at last season's Premier League teams who got relegated. 2 out of the 3 didn't stay up. 1 made the playoffs, Sheffield United, and were beaten in the semi-finals. Fulham obviously won the league, and West Brom really struggled and ended up languishing in mid-table. So it can be a tough adaptation period, but ultimately Norwich have done this bit very well in the past, this transition to the Championship. And even though personally I feel probably as concerned as I have done after a relegation for various reasons around what the squad looks like and different elements, maybe including the disconnect that fans are feeling at the moment. And there's been plenty written and plenty said on that. We spoke about it at length on last week's podcast. They do tend to get this bit right quite often and have done recently, and actually compared to other relegated clubs and also lots of clubs in the Championship, they're in a relatively strong position. So I know every relegation feels like chaos and feels like the world is ending in a football sense. Maybe it doesn't have to be that way if we're to apply some balance onto the situation.
Yeah, obviously, historically, Norwich have always managed to often bounce back at the first time of asking. So there's no real reason why they couldn't do that again. And as Pat alluded to, the likes of Burnley are in a lot sort of worse financial position than what Norwich are. And you'd back Norwich with most of the squad they've got. Sort of the main core of players have obviously been there and done it before. They know how to get out of this league and not just get out of this league, but get sort of, the high 90s in terms of points. So there's no real reason why they can't go and do that again. Obviously, that ultimately is the problem. Norwich have got a squad that, even when they go to the Premier League, is probably more of a Championship outfit than a Premier League outfit. So I think if they can quickly shift and forget this season and get themselves in a sort of mental place where they can really attack the Championship next season and the teams that are in it, then I really can't see a reason why Norwich can't be in at least that top 6 mix. Obviously, the transfer window is pretty crucial. Obviously, Stuart Webber has been heavily criticised for his Premier League recruitment, but at the Championship, we've seen it now for 2 or 3 seasons where he's often got the Championship recruitment bang on the money. And most of the times where he's had that Championship recruitment, he's not really had a lot of financial sort of opportunity to really spend. And if Norwich can obviously get a few sales, and the fact that they are in a fairly decent financial position going down to the Championship, if they can sort of spend the money wisely and get some very good Championship sort of players, then I really don't see any reason why they can't be in amongst that mix. Obviously, there's a lot of teams probably in the Championship that maybe feel like they've got an opportunity this season. I think obviously Swansea under Russell Martin, I think they're the kind of team that, Norwich should probably go fear, because they've been in that division. They've maybe got a bit of an identity now, and they know how to maybe sort of grind out some points in the Championship. And Norwich got to get back to being able to grind out points in games where maybe at 90th minute they're 1-0 up. They're going to have to see out games where this season we've seen that sort of frailty in their game where they do concede a lot of goals. So they need to quickly sort of snap out of that. And I think, kick on straight away, and that's probably going to be the most important thing. I think if Norwich don't start the season well, then I can see it being a difficult season, almost like what West Brom have done, where they actually started the season quite well, but they free falled into sort of a mid-table finish. I think Norwich have basically got to kick on and really maintain that over the course of the season.
Yes, agreed. And it's going to be interesting to see how they navigate that fall, because it can be so difficult. And they have had a bit of time to prepare as well, particularly over someone like Burnley, whose fate have only been confirmed this weekend. And that's kind of before you get into the reports around the financial side of their club at the moment, as Paddy outlined, which is really quite concerning. So there maybe is an argument to suggest that Norwich will have an advantage over several in terms of situationally, but also financially as well. It's just a case of whether, as we spoke about earlier in the pod, they can transition and do all the work that needs to be done in such a short period of time, and whether they can get it to look like something that is a polished championship promotion competing outfit by the time we all start again. But worth noting, in the last two campaigns, both of which ended with the championship title, they didn't exactly fly out of the blocks either. So I'm sure there will be an element of patience afforded to Dean Smith ahead of next season. Paddy, you wrote something a little while back. You probably don't even remember writing it, but you said when Norwich City sacked Daniel Farke, their project lost a little bit of purity, which I think is spot on, but also quite interesting when you find the situation they're in at the moment, because if you look back at some of the interviews that Stuart Webber gave after relegation a couple of years ago, it was all talk about how it would be different next time, and it was very much the case last summer about why this season would be different. Ultimately, it's not panned out of that. Is there an element to say that maybe this, I don't know if I'd call it a silence, but certainly a period of consideration about what the message will be? Is that a suggestion maybe that they've almost run out of narrative in terms of what this project now is? Because as you wrote, ditching Daniel Farke was a completely different step in a new direction, and one that has ultimately produced the same result. So where do you go from here if you are Stuart Webber trying to put out a message of what comes next and what the future and what next season and the next time they're in the Premier League, if they're in the Premier League again, we hope they are obviously, what that looks like?
Difficult. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, you would say that when rather than if Stuart Webber does do some media in some form, there will be elements. Anything he says, that's it. They've had enough. They don't want to hear it. Whether it's trying to be positive, and as you said, they're kind of trying, the mea culpa again, which we got 2 seasons ago at this stage when they'd gone down. That the buck stops with me. I think it was paraphrasing him. But, don't train your guns on Daniel Farke. Basically, that we didn't back him well enough recruitment wise, and he almost didn't have a chance before he got started in that season. Even if he went down that path again and tried to take some of the heat off, Dean Smith, people won't have it. People won't have it because they've heard it before. So it's very hard to really see what he can say different. And of course, we've got, rightly or wrongly, we've got the whole toxicity around, that Times interview prior to the Newcastle defeat. The implication that he somehow isn't fully committed anymore, that he's distracted, that his head's elsewhere. He would refute that very strongly, I'm sure. We said at the time, we'll still maintain, these 90% sound bites that people have jumped on. That clearly is bears no relation to the man's commitment to the football club. Because he's built this up. Why would he want to go in a direction where that is now in jeopardy? Because it's ultimately his legacy, fundamentally. This is, while he still remains in his position, then this will all flow into not only the positive parts of what he's achieved, and undoubtedly he has. I wrote about it at the weekend. You will measure it in bricks and mortar. You can measure it in the financial state that he inherited and where they are now. You can measure it in terms of 2 thrilling championship title wins and a brand of football which Norwich fans will salivate for many years. All of those are hugely positive, and they will be a tribute to his legacy and wherever he goes from now, and however this plays out from now. But also, if you're going to flag those elements, you equally have to say palpably he's been found wanting in terms of Premier League recruitment for two consecutive seasons now. First time in his defence, he didn't have really the funds to do anything. second time around, he certainly did. And he said at the time, if we go down, it won't be as a result of what we spent or the recruitment in terms of the scale of it. That will not be used as mitigation. So as a result, we'd take him at his word. And when he does do some media, he can't really say, well, we only spent 50 million. Look at what X spent or Y spent, because that won't wash. Because if we judge him by his own measure and his own sound bites, he said it wouldn't be about this time around about their recruitment, both in scale and scope. So, I've said it a few times already. I think his next public utterances as Norwich City sporting director are the most important since he took over in 2017, because they will either frame what comes next and whether he's a leading part of that, and whether fans are willing to accept that and get behind what comes next, or if it has the same impact in a negative fashion as that recent Times interview, then it's very hard to see where we go with him and more broadly the football club, because that would be deeply troubling if there's no acceptance of where they've gone wrong and some understanding of what they're going to do to put that right. So make no mistake, he's in a very difficult position, and that probably, it's well documented. We're on the outside at present, but that may be why we are sat here recording this on Tuesday lunchtime, and we yet to hear from the club, because they know, presumably internally, that the next time he has a microphone put under his nose or a camera switched on or a dictaphone, what he says and how he says it really can shape the narrative, can transform the mood, both in a positive and a negative way. It is as important as that. It really is. And, I wouldn't really envy him being in that position, knowing that, he needs to come out and perform in a way that he's never performed before. That is for sure. Because, if he still believes, A, he's the person to drive it, B, he wants to be the person to drive it beyond, as we were told, when his existing deal runs out formally at the end of this month, and then the rolling contract, which he'd verbally agreed, kicks in. We're still to have it confirmed if he has actually signed that. But if he still believes he wants to be part of it, then, he's got a job on to convince a lot of sceptical fans, that is for sure, that he is the man to take this forward now. And in terms of your broader point about, is this a marked departure? It's probably still too early to tell in terms of, have we now diverged in a radical fashion from what Daniel Farke stood for, what he was about, the type of football? Because to go back to the previous point, Dean Smith, I don't think, has done anything more than inherit a group of players and tried by hook or by crook to, go to every page of the coaching playbook in a desperate attempt to meld something from constituent parts that he inherited. So it's too premature, I think, to say we've had a radical departure in terms of the football and the Norwich way. And, it just popped into my head. Actually, Dean Smith did say recently that I wouldn't be here if my beliefs and sort of footballing philosophy didn't chime with Stuart Webber. He actually said that. So you would argue probably we haven't seen much evidence of if Stuart Webber's philosophy was encapsulated by how Daniel Farke moulded a Norwich City team, then we've seen precious little of that so far. But if Dean Smith feels he's on the same page as Stuart Webber and Stuart Webber still believes in those guiding principles, then by definition, we should start to see evidence of a style of play which is attractive, which is progressive, which is pleasing on the eye, as it was under Daniel when he got his feet under the table and was able to sort of mould a team in his image, basically. So, yeah, too early in terms of the footballing dimension of this project, but in terms of what they stand for, what they believe in, what they think is possible, that's an interesting element for me of when Stuart Webber speaks next up. Is there going to be any acceptance or understanding or concession that a self-funded model comes with limitations that maybe will always preclude them from being competitive in the Premier League? I don't expect him to frame it quite in those terms, but will that be the inference that, yes, we made mistakes, I made mistakes, we got a few things wrong, but ultimately I don't think the self-funded model will be able to sustain us in the Premier League. That would be an interesting dynamic. What that would say for moving forward as well. It would probably pose more questions at this stage until there's some ownership change, and that does change. Because if you're saying that there is a ceiling, there is a limit to what can be achieved. Maybe they've achieved the maximum they can under this model, which is a whole different debate. But as I say, we can talk and talk and talk and talk, but there's only one person who needs to talk now, and that's the sporting director.
Yeah, I'm just going to bounce it back to you, Pat, because I mean we haven't actually discussed this in a podcast, and I don't want to go on into real length about it because we don't want to make it about us. But I think it's probably maybe clear to point out why we keep maybe hinting at us not actually being in the room when that media takes place with Stuart Webber as things stand. We're not expecting to be. So just sort of rather than what's happened, because I think most people probably know that, where we are at with it, because it at the moment it hasn't really moved on in truth in terms of our dialogue with either Stuart Webber or the club necessarily.
No, whereas as you were, Connor, there's been very little dialogue really, if we're being honest, with the football club since those rather uncomfortable few days around the Newcastle interview prior to from the Times. Then obviously that evening news front page. We don't need to go into the minutiae of it, but Stuart Webber's reaction to that, just to reiterate, was will not engage with our organisation as a result of that front page. And given that Stuart Webber is widely expected to actually do some media, we won't be part of that in terms of in the room and asking questions on behalf of fans. I hasten to add, as I've reiterated a few times, that's all we are. We're a channel, and without blowing our own trumpet, a rather wide channel, rather deep channel within the local market. And it seems very strange that they don't want to use those channels to communicate directly with a fan base who are frustrated and in some quarters disgruntled. But as we sit here and record, there's been no communication from club figures to suggest that there is any thaw in terms of Stuart Webber. But it's worth reiterating, there's no ban. It's not like we can't go and speak to Dean, or wasn't able to go and speak to Dean Smith and ask Dean Smith questions. We were, but there's degrees of how this may play out from here. Obviously, as we move into, transfer windows and tours and what have you, and then beyond that, the football season to come. So fundamentally, we're open, willing, and very happy to try and de-escalate the situation. But you need two parties, shall we say, to be willing to do that. And as we sit here, that isn't the case. So nobody wins fundamentally. And until there's an acceptance on all sides that is the case, then we'll continue to be in a holding pattern. But it certainly won't preclude us from covering the club as we have done, as we will continue to do. We were there in League One. I didn't see too many national media types there. We were there in the Glen Roeder era. I don't want to go down a long historical timeline, but essentially, wherever, whenever Norwich City have played in many decades, our company and whatever various guys it's been called has been there every step of the way, and that will continue.
Yes, absolutely. Just finally, then a couple of parish notices at the end of the pod. Lucas Rupp is going to leave the club at the end of his contract. Adam, there's been kind of some split opinion on this. I quite like Lucas Rupp. I thought he was a good player, particularly when we saw the best of him. I would argue last season in the Championship in that central midfield role. I think from what we're led to believe, it was a fairly mutual parting of the ways. Probably neither party particularly keen to extend his stay, but probably one on reflection that got damaged by injuries, really, because we saw glimpses of sometimes quite a good player, certainly one that could make an impact at this level. But I think it was only 60 or 70 games that he played for the club. Not a massive amount for someone who signed, obviously, in January 2020. But how would you reflect on his time at the club?
Yeah, 62 games, 2 goals, 3 assists. So not particularly high numbers in terms of his sort of contribution towards goals. He's a very technically gifted midfielder. I thought he always gave 110%. And I was actually, similarly to you, I thought he was quite a good midfielder. And particularly this season, when he's sort of come on the pitch, well, mainly off the bench, I've actually thought he's come on and made a bit of an impact. I sort of go back to certain other games this season, especially sort of around about that Christmas period when he came on, and I thought he was probably the best midfielder on the pitch in quite a few games. So definitely at Championship level, there was a player there that you could have. I think Dean Smith, liked him as well. So there's definitely a player there you could have used and utilised to your own benefits. But effectively, as it's come down to, it's the injury record that's the problem, and Norwich can't probably afford a player that's probably demands quite high wages on their books, and he's not actually contributing much on the pitch in terms of minutes. So for that reason, it probably is best to part ways with them and get someone in with a little bit more of a fresh injection, maybe a little bit of a younger profile that maybe knows the Championship as well, and Norwich can maybe build off for future seasons rather than Lucas Rupp maybe for just one more season where you then have to replace him if you eventually got another promotion to the Premier League, or albeit another Championship season the year after.
Indeed, and I suppose finally, Pad, the only other real thing to speak about is Teemu Pukki and the player of the season. I mean, no real surprise in that. We were all kind of sat here last week, and I think he was top of all of our top threes, and I think he was probably top three of all the fans who voted or managed to get a vote in. It was obviously he was presented with his trophy on Sunday, but the actual kind of announcement was made in the middle of the week, which has been done for the last 2 years. But of course, those were in COVID times, as traditionally been done in front of fans on the final day of the season. But he was presented with it. Bryony Williams won the Women's Award as well, the goalkeeper who had played a major part in their sort of survival campaign. But for Teemu Pukki, he becomes the 9th player to win it twice. It's an exclusive club that he's in. It's another record that we're speaking about with him, but just to touch upon him and the award. I mean, at times he's made Norwich feel a bit like a one-man team, but after the contribution and the performances that he's had this season, he was probably the only winner, wasn't he? Really?
Yeah, hard to other than Grant Hanley, certainly hard to construct an argument. There was a viable alternative. I mean, you say that he's won it twice now. Few would bet against him emulating, and we did. Adam and myself and Sam, we did the Monday Night Club on the PinkUn Plus podcast about comparing him with Grant Holt. Sorry, yeah, Grant. I was going to say Grant Hanley then, but Grant Holt, who, as we know, won it 3 times in that magnificent kind of rich era, led by Paul Lambert, which went League One, Championship, Premier League. But obviously, there's a big caveat there. And although they've contractually took up the 12 months, and contractually he would be here for another season, because of what he did, 11 goals again for the second consecutive Premier League season in a poor team, a failing team. And also, I think he was top assist maker as well. Just phenomenal, really, that he's carried that burden of responsibility. But that will not go unnoticed. I'm sure clubs in England and further afield will have a look at him this summer. But if now Norwich, going back to the previous discussion about what the transfer window needs to look like, could look like, obviously, they need to keep him in the building, absolutely. And if they do that, then I wouldn't, injury permitting, I wouldn't put against him, possibly winning it for a third time, which would be, not the most maybe broader outside of Norfolk and Norwich, the eye-catching achievement of him in a Norwich shirt. But certainly, I think that would be an accurate reflection of the massive impact he's had. He's a legend. He's a modern day legend, and however it goes from here now, he can leave, and I'm sure is always guaranteed a very, very warm reception, because he's been a special player, a special character as well, and it was nice that that was recognised. But let's hope it's not the end of the Teemu Pukki Norwich City story.
Absolutely not. There we go. Thank you, gents. I think that's probably the last words, hopefully, that we'll ever have to utter on this season. It's been pretty horrendous, hasn't it? No doubt it won't be, though. There's plenty more to still be written and covered on it. Of course, that marks kind of our last podcast of the season. We'll keep them going throughout the summer for various reasons. They may well end up maybe not being as consistent as they are through the regular season, where there's so much to talk about. But we'll certainly bring them to you as and when, maybe when there's a signing, or someone eventually does come out and speak. We'll certainly bring some reflective words via a podcast to you then. But we've spoken probably hours about Norwich City this season on here. We've written God knows how many words and travelled loads of miles, and next season we get to do all the same again. I think Norwich City's closest away trip next season is Luton, which is 100 miles. So we're going to be spending a fair amount on petrol, I should think. Gents, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you all very much for listening today and throughout the season. Enjoy the summer. The weather's started to get out a little bit more, hasn't it? So go away, don't think about football for a little while, and hopefully come back in a few weeks when that new season optimism will hopefully begin to build. See you soon.